In the vast, unforgiving expanse of the ocean, piracy had once been a lucrative, if dangerous, way of life. The lawless seas offered freedom to those daring enough to stake their claim. But as the years passed, the nature of piracy shifted. The once glorious treasure hunts gave way to brutal, desperate acts, driven more by hunger than by greed. However, there was one thing that even the most desperate pirates, starving and suffering, would never touch: a human supply line. Captain Kieran Reid, a pirate hardened by years of endless raiding, stood on the deck of his ship, the Phantom's shadow. The crew was weak, their faces gaunt, their hands trembling from the hunger that gnawed at their bellies. They hadn't seen a proper meal in days, and the few scraps of fish they had managed to catch had hardly been enough to sustain them. "Captain," first mate Elias called out, his voice hoarse, "we can't keep going like this. We need food, or we'll be done for. There's a merchant convoy passing just north of here. It's our best chance." Kieran's eyes, sharp and calculating, narrowed as he looked out across the churning sea. The convoy Elias spoke of was a tempting prize, a lifeline for his starving crew. But there was something Kieran had learned over the years that made him hesitate. He turned to his first mate, his voice calm but heavy with authority. "You know why we don't raid those ships, Elias," Kieran said. "The moment we touch a human supply line, we cross a line that even the fiercest pirate cannot return from." Elias frowned. "We're dying, Captain. That convoy is practically right in front of us. What else are we supposed to do?" Kieran walked to the edge of the ship and gazed into the distance, his mind racing. He had heard the rumors, whispers in dark taverns, and warnings from the few sailors who had lived to tell the tale. There were certain ships that couldn't be touched, certain cargoes that came with a cost far worse than any pirate could imagine. The human supply line wasn't just a convoy of merchants, it was the last vestige of hope for many coastal villages, the thin thread that kept communities from collapsing. To attack one of those ships was to target the very essence of humanity's survival. It wasn't just food, medicine, and supplies, it was the lifeblood of people who had nothing else. And while pirates were known for their brutality, even they had a code, a sense of honor that kept them from descending into madness. But more than that, Kieran knew the true danger. The human supply line was guarded by the most terrifying force he had ever encountered, the Black Armada. The Black Armada wasn't a fleet of soldiers or mercenaries. It was a shadowy collective of survivors who had once been pirates themselves, but had turned their skills to protect those who lived on the edge of the sea. They had nothing to lose, and they would stop at nothing to ensure that the human supply line remained safe. Some said they were a myth, but Kieran had seen the evidence firsthand. Ships that had tried to attack the convoys had never been seen again, their wreckage floating aimlessly, as though the sea itself had rejected them. "We've heard the stories, Elias," Kieran said, his voice low and grim. "The Black Armada doesn't just sink ships, they destroy everything. They make sure no one survives. You raid their supply line, and you're not just fighting a ship, you're fighting a reckoning." Elias swallowed hard, his face a mixture of disbelief and dread. "But if we don't act, we'll die out here. There's no other way." Kieran turned back to the crew, who were silently watching from the deck, their eyes hollow with hunger. He could feel the weight of their desperation pressing down on him, but despite the gnawing pain in his stomach, despite the voices in his mind urging him to take the easy route, Kieran knew what had to be done. "We'll sail north," Kieran said firmly, turning to face the wind, "but not to attack. We'll wait for the convoy to pass, and we'll watch." A murmur of disappointment spread through the crew. They had been hoping for a quick, bloody raid, but Kieran's decision was final. They would survive in it by killing, but by remembering what they had once been. As the Phantom's shadow sailed through the cold, grey waters, the pirate crew remained still, watching the horizon. The convoy, guarded and slow-moving, passed them by unharmed, unbothered. Kieran didn't feel relief, but he felt something strange, a sense of purpose. They might starve, but they would not betray the last shred of honor they had. And as the convoy disappeared into the distance, Kieran knew that even the most desperate pirates understood one thing: there were lines in the sand that must never be crossed. Some things were worth more than survival. Days turned into weeks as the crew of the Phantom's shadow sailed through the storm-tossed seas, following the convoy from a distance, never daring to strike. The wind howled around them, and the waves grew more unpredictable. as though nature itself was testing their resolve. Hunger gnawed at them with every passing day, and the crew's patience wore thin. But Kieran stood firm, a pillar of stubborn resolve in the chaos. Yet, even Kieran couldn't ignore the growing anxiety in his crew. First mate Elias had become more vocal in his frustration, his once loyal demeanor shifting into something darker. It was clear that the patience required for this mission was starting to break. "We can't keep doing this, Captain," Elias said one evening as he paced the deck, his boots heavy against the planks. "We're dying out here, slowly. The men are looking to you for leadership, but we're starving. You said we'd survive without raiding the convoy, but I'm not so sure anymore. You're gambling with lives now." Kieran clenched his jaw, his hands gripping the ship's wheel, staring out into the endless stretch of water. He knew Elias was right. The crew's strength was fading, and mutiny had become a distant but very real threat. "We're not gambling, Elias. We're choosing the right path," Kieran responded coldly, his voice carrying the weight of his decision. "If we become no better than the monsters who attack innocent ships, then what's the point of living at all?" Elias stopped pacing and turned to face the captain, his eyes burning with frustration. "What do you expect us to do, Captain? We're pirates. This is what we do. If we can't raid, then what are we?" Kieran remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. In the distance, the convoy was still visible, steadfast, moving forward, but there was something new. The glint of another ship had appeared, cutting through the fog ahead of them. "That's not a convoy ship," Kieran muttered under his breath. His sharp eyes picked up the flag flying above the distant vessel, a black flag, emblazoned with a white skull and crossed swords. It was unmistakable. It was one of the ships of the Black Armada. "Get below deck," Kieran shouted, his voice now urgent. "All hands on deck. Ma, we need to move it quickly." Panic spread quickly through the crew. The Black Armada had arrived. As the crew scrambled into action, Kieran's mind raced. The Armada didn't just guard the supply liners, they also had a reputation for striking down anyone foolish enough to challenge them. They didn't give warnings, they didn't negotiate. Their tactics were brutal, and the stories told of whole crews disappearing without a trace, as if they were simply erased from existence. But the Black Armada wasn't just about brute force. They were strategic, calculating. They knew that pirates like Kieran had their codes and principles. If they'd seen the ship from afar, they would already be preparing a trap, setting a course to force the pirates into a deadly decision. Kieran knew they wouldn't escape. His only hope was to take the fight to them before they had a chance to surround them, but the odds were insurmountable. The Black Armada's ships were heavily armed and faster than the Phantom's shadow. "Elias," Kieran bellowed, "we need to be smart. Get to the cannons, aim for their sails. Don't engage until we're certain of the wind." Elias hesitated for a moment, then nodded and ran to the cannons, barking orders to the crew. As Kieran joined him, he took a deep breath, eyes scanning the water, trying to gauge the movements of the approaching Black Armada ship. Time was running out. The wind shifted abruptly, an eerie silence preceding the inevitable clash, and then a voice rang out from the fog, a voice carrying across the waters. "You think you can outrun us, Red? We've been watching you." Kieran frowned. He turned to see a figure standing at the prow of the approaching ship, a man cloaked in black, the very embodiment of the Black Armada. He was tall, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but the cruelty in his voice was unmistakable. "We've been waiting for you to slip up," the man continued, his words like ice. "And here you are, stranded, hungry, with no escape. You're not pirates anymore. You're just desperate men, hoping for a miracle. But there are no miracles in the Black Armada, Captain." Kieran clenched his fists. The game had changed. There was no longer a choice in how they would die. The Black Armada's tactics were simple: break the spirit of their enemies first, then destroy them. The crew watched in growing dread as the Black Armada ship came closer, a wall of silent menace. Kieran stepped forward, his face hardening. He wasn't about to let his men die in fear. "You want a fight?" Kieran shouted. "Then come and take it." The man on the other ship laughed, a chilling sound that echoed across the water. "Prepare to meet your end, Red. Your code has failed you." In that moment, Kieran knew they were outmatched, but he also knew this: even if they were going to die, they would die as pirates. They would not become slaves to their desperation. They would go down fighting. The cannons roared to life as Kieran ordered the crew to unleash hell, and so began the final battle between Kieran Reid and the Black Armada, a battle that would forever mark the end of the old age of piracy, where honor held sway, and the beginning of a new, darker era where survival had no code.
The first cannonball struck the side of the Phantom's shadow with a deafening crash, sending splinters of wood flying in every direction. The force of the blast shook the entire ship, knocking some of the crew off their feet, but Kieran's voice rang out immediately above the chaos, sharp and commanding. "Return fire, don't let them break our line." The crew, despite their exhaustion, leapt into action. Elias was at the cannons, barking orders and guiding the crew to load and fire with precision. The Black Armada's ship closed in, its towering sails blocking out the sky like a storm, but Kieran knew they had to hold their ground. He gripped the wheel tightly, steering the Phantom's shadow toward the oncoming assault with grim determination. "Don't let them board," Kieran shouted, his voice steady, though every fiber of his being was taut with tension. He glanced over at the Black Armada's ship, where the figure at the helm, a tall, imposing figure cloaked in black, watched them with cold, calculating eyes. The leader of the Black Armada wasn't just a myth, a whispered tale in pirate taverns. He was real, and he had come to deliver judgment. A second volley of cannonballs ripped through the air, narrowly missing the Phantom's shadow but shredding the rigging above them. The sails flapped violently, barely catching the wind. The ship lurched, causing the crew to stagger, but they held fast, eyes fixed on the relentless enemy ahead. "We can't take another hit like that," Elias yelled as he wiped the sweat from his brow, his eyes wild with the panic of the battle. "We need to make a run for it." "No," Kieran said, his jaw clenched. "If we run, we'll never outrun them. We fight." The Black Armada's ship closed in faster now, its dark figure looming like a predator ready to pounce. The pirate ship's cannons fired again, sending a wave of fire and smoke crashing toward their foes. Kieran's heart raced as he heard the thundering sound of the blast, but when the smoke cleared, the Black Armada's ship hadn't even flinched. Their armor was too strong. A scream split the air, and Kieran turned just in time to see a massive grappling hook shoot through the air, latching onto the side of the Phantom's shadow. Before anyone could react, the first of the Black Armada's men were climbing aboard, dark figures emerging from the fog, their swords glinting in the dim light. "Boarders!" Elias shouted, drawing his cutlass. Kieran grabbed his own blade and charged forward, his crew following close behind. The first Black Armada pirates landed with silent precision, like shadows in the night. They were relentless, trained killers, their faces hidden beneath dark masks, moving as one, their eyes full of cold fury. Kieran's sword met the first of them, a man with a blade as black as the night. Steel clashed, the sound of it ringing out over the roar of the battle. The pirate was fast, but Kieran was faster, parrying a vicious strike and countering with a brutal cut to the man's side. The Black Armada pirate fell to the deck, but before Kieran could catch his breath, another charged at him, their blades flashing like lightning. Elias was a blur beside him, cutting through the enemy with savage efficiency. The crew fought fiercely, but they were outnumbered, the Black Armada's disciplined force overwhelming their desperate ranks. Amid the chaos, Kieran spotted the figure in black, the leader, watching from the edge of the deck, seemingly untouched by the fighting around him. His eyes locked onto Kieran's with an icy intensity. "You're still holding onto that code of yours?" the leader called out, his voice carrying above the din of battle. "You still believe that pirates can have honor? That there's something worth saving out here in these waters?" Kieran gritted his teeth. "We're pirates, but we're not monsters, and we won't let you erase us or the people we protect." The leader smiled grimly, raising his hand. With a signal, the remaining Black Armada pirates surged forward, closing the gap. They came in waves, relentless and merciless. Kieran fought with everything he had, his breath ragged, his limbs aching, but he could feel the weight of the battle pressing down on him. His crew was growing weaker, their strength fading as the battle dragged on. He looked back at the Phantom's shadow, their ship, their home, and saw the sails beginning to tear, the wood groaning under the relentless barrage. "We can't win this fight, Captain," Elias shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos. He was covered in blood, and the fight was draining from him. "We have to pull back, before it's too late." Kieran hesitated. In his heart, he knew Elias was right. If they didn't retreat now, they would all be slaughtered. The Black Armada was too powerful, but to retreat was to lose everything they had fought for, to betray the code that had kept them together through the hardest of times. As the Black Armada closed in, Kieran made a choice. He signaled to Elias and the rest of the crew. "Fall back," Kieran ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We won't fight them here, we'll make it out." With a final push, Kieran and Elias led the crew toward the aft of the Phantom's Shadow, fighting their way through the Black Armada pirates as they retreated toward the lifeboats. The leader of the Black Armada stepped forward, his eyes cold as he watched the retreat unfold. "You're giving up?" the leader asked, almost disappointed. "You're throwing away your honor for your life?" Kieran stopped, turning to face him for the final time. His sword was covered in blood, his body battered, but his resolve remained unbroken. "No," Kieran said, his voice steady and full of defiance. "We're not giving up, we're just choosing how we live to fight another day." With that, he turned and sprinted toward the lifeboats, his crew following close behind. The Black Armada's ship loomed over them, but Kieran's heart did not waver. He would survive this battle, and when the time came, he would find a way to face the Black Armada again on his own terms. The Phantom's Shadow may have been broken, but the spirit of its crew was not, and in the end, that was the one thing the Black Armada could never take from them. The battle was lost, but the war was far from over.
The lifeboats hit the water with a jarring splash, and the crew of the Phantom's Shadow scrambled aboard, their movements urgent but careful. As Kieran helped the last of his men into the boat, he stole one last look at their sinking ship. The Black Armada had overrun them, but the Phantom's Shadow was more than just a ship. It was a symbol, a home, and the crew's only real connection to the freedom they had once known. As the lifeboats drifted away, the sea felt colder. The Black Armada's ship loomed in the distance, a silent predator waiting for them to make the wrong move. Kieran didn't know what would happen next, but he understood that the fight wasn't over. This was only the beginning. They paddled through the night, the only sounds being the splashing of the oars and the faint crackling of the fires aboard the Phantom's Shadow as it burned in the distance. The moon hung high, its pale light reflecting off the water like a silent witness to their defeat. "We need to get to the coast," Elias said, his voice hoarse from the battle and exhaustion. His face was pale, and he looked like he was about to collapse, but there was a determination in his eyes that Kieran had seen countless times before. "I know," Kieran replied. His voice was steady, but the weight of what had just happened pressed down on him. The crew had survived, but at what cost? The Black Armada had destroyed everything they'd built. Or worse still, they'd sent a message, the pirate coded, the honor of their people. It didn't matter anymore. The world had moved on, and it seemed there was no place left for men like them. Kieran turned his gaze to the horizon. The coastline was still far off, and there was no guarantee they would make it without being pursued, but they had no choice but to keep moving forward. As the night stretched on, Kieran's mind raced. How had things gone so wrong? In the past, pirates like him had lived by their own rules. They didn't answer to kings or queens, or the endless waves of authority that had begun to swallow the seas. But the rise of the Black Armada had changed everything. It wasn't just about gold or treasure anymore. It was about survival, and in the harsh new world that had risen from the ashes of the old one, pirates like Kieran were quickly becoming obsolete. Yet, as the days dragged on, and the small lifeboats slowly made their way toward the coastline, Kieran knew one thing with certainty: they couldn't let the Black Armada have the final word. Not yet. The Black Armada may have crushed their ship, but it hadn't crushed their will. By the time the first light of dawn crept across the horizon, they had reached the shore. The land was desolate, windswept sand dunes and jagged rocks. There was no sign of life, only the remnants of forgotten, abandoned places. But it was land, and for now, that was enough. The crew stumbled ashore, their bodies worn, their clothes ragged. There were no cheers, no celebration, only silence and the harsh wind that cut through them like a blade. The crew knew they had escaped death by a hair's breadth, but they also knew that the real fight was still ahead. "We can't stay here long," Elias said, looking around warily. "The Black Armada will come for us. It's just a matter of time." Kieran nodded. He was already thinking ahead. They needed supplies, allies, and most importantly, they needed a plan to rise again. "We're not hiding," Kieran said with quiet resolve. "We rebuild, we find others, and we make sure the Black Armada knows that this fight isn't over. We'll take back what's ours." Elias gave a grim nod, but the spark of hope that had died in his eyes during the retreat flickered back to life. "You really think we can, after all this?" We have to, Kieran replied. For the crew, for the Phantom's shadow, for everything we've lost. The men set to work, finding what they could in the desolate land. Some of them collapsed, exhausted beyond a measure, but others were already gathering their strength. They built a camp, gathered whatever remnants of their old supplies they could salvage, and prepared for what came next. But all the while, Kieran kept his eyes on the horizon, knowing that whatever they had to do next would require more than just surviving. It would require them to change. The next few days were spent recovering what they called repairing their battered bodies, salvaging supplies, and most importantly, strategizing. Kieran had been a pirate all his life, and he'd led his crew through the fiercest storms and bloodiest battles. But this felt different. The Black Armada wasn't just an enemy to be fought, it was an idea, a force that had reshaped the world. But Kieran knew something the Black Armada didn't. They underestimated what made pirates like him dangerous. It wasn't their guns, their swords, or their ships. It was their refusal to give up. No matter the odds, pirates might be outlawed, but they had something no empire or navy could ever take away: freedom. By the 5th day on the shore, Kieran gathered his crew around a campfire, their faces illuminated by the flickering light. "We don't fight as we did before," he said, his voice strong and full of conviction. "We fight smarter. We find allies among those who are oppressed, who have nothing left. We'll build a new fleet, one that's not just about plundering, but about fighting for something greater. We will remind the world what it means to be free." The crew looked to him, their faces battered but resolute. They were still alive, still together, and that meant there was still hope. Kieran looked out at the stars, the ocean beyond. The Phantom's shadow might have been lost, but they would find a new ship, a new purpose. The Black Armada had dealt them a blow, but Kieran knew this fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. "To the sea," Kieran said, his voice quiet but filled with unshakable resolve. "We sail once more, and we make the world remember who we are." And so, with the dawn rising behind them, the crew of the Phantom's shadow set off into the unknown, ready to reclaim their place in the world, no matter the cost. As the crew set their course along the barren coastline, Kieran couldn't help but feel the weight of their new reality settle on him like a cloak. They were no longer pirates in the traditional sense, and no longer the bold, marauding men of legend who plundered and pillaged for gold and glory. They were something else now, something new, forged by necessity and circumstance. It had been nearly a week since they'd escaped the Black Armada's clutches, and already they had made significant progress toward building their future. A few of the men had gone off to scavenge nearby wrecks that had once been ships of fortune, but now were nothing more than sunken graves. They had managed to find a few barrels of salted meat, some fresh water, and enough scrap wood to make repairs to their makeshift camp. They weren't exactly thriving, but they were surviving. The next phase was a gamble. Kieran knew that the only way to fight back against the Black Armada, to stand a chance at taking the fight to them, was to rebuild their strength. They needed a new ship, not just any ship, but one that could match the terrifying might of the Black Armada's warships. They had no idea where to start, only that they had to find it, and fast. One evening, as Kieran sat by the fire with Elias and the rest of the crew, the shadows of the night seemed heavier than usual. The distant sound of the ocean crashing against the shore filled the silence between them, but there was an unspoken weight that hung over the camp. "We've been stuck here too long," Elias said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "If we don't find a way out soon, we're going to lose everything. We've barely got enough to keep going another month." Kieran glanced at the men sitting around the fire. They were tired, desperate, and hungry. The reality of their situation was sinking in hard now that the adrenaline of the battle had worn off. Their morale was fading, and it wouldn't take much for them to fracture. "Not everything," Kieran replied. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that carried the strength of the conviction he'd never let go. "We have each other, and we have a plan." Elias was silent for a moment, studying Kieran's face. He knew better than anyone how dangerous Kieran's plans could be, but that was what made him such a fierce leader. There was always a chance, even when the odds were insurmountable. "You've got something in mind, don't you?" Elias asked, a wry grin tugging at the corner of his lips. Kieran leaned forward, his voice lowering as he spoke to the crew. "We may not have a ship, but there are others out there who do. We're not the only ones in the fight. The Black Armada is spreading its influence across the seas, but there are still pockets of resistance. Pirates, smugglers, anyone who hasn't yet bent their knee to the Armada. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Some were skeptical, others hopeful. They had all heard whispers of groups hiding in the shadows, fighting back against the rising empire, but nothing concrete, nothing tangible. Kieran continued, eyes burning with an unwavering fire. We're going to find these groups, we're going to unite them, and when we do, we'll have a fleet powerful enough to strike back. We can't take on the Armada alone, but together, we have a chance. Elias chuckled, his laugh low but genuine. That's a tall order, Captain. You're asking us to unite a bunch of pirates, the same pirates who've spent years fighting each other for scraps. Yes, Kieran said without hesitation. They'll fight if we give them a reason, if we show them what's at stake. The Black Armada isn't just killing us, they're killing everything we stand for. They're killing our freedom. The camp fell silent again. The men were listening now, their eyes alight with the spark of something they hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. A distant thought, perhaps, but it was there, flickering like a flame. We need a symbol, Kieran continued, something that tells the world we're not finished, something that unites us all under one flag. We'll find a new ship, one that can stand against the Armada, and we'll sail it together. Elias leaned back, nodding. A new flag, a new crew, a new future, Kieran affirmed, his gaze fixed firmly on the horizon. It's not just about surviving anymore, it's about fighting for something bigger than ourselves. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. The crew gathered what little supplies they had left, rationing their food and water while they plotted their next move. They decided to head south, to the islands where they had heard rumors of pirate havens, places where ships could be repaired, and alliances formed in secrecy. The Black Armada had made it difficult for any true pirate to operate, but there were always cracks in the Empire's armor, places where their hold was weaker. Kieran and Elias spent hours planning their route, making sure they stayed hidden from the Armada's watchful eyes. There was no room for error. The Black Armada had eyes everywhere, and any slip could mean their end. After a week of sailing, they finally arrived at one of the hidden islands shrouded in mist and surrounded by jagged reefs, making it nearly impossible to find unless you knew where to look. The island was small, almost forgotten, but it held a reputation. It was a haven for those who had refused to bow to the Armada's rule. The men on the island were wary at first, but after Kieran's crew shared their story, a tense sort of camaraderie began to form. Word spread quickly among the island's inhabitants, and soon, Kieran was standing in front of a group of pirate captains, each one as fierce as the last. They were skeptical, but Kieran's words had a fire to them that couldn't be ignored. The Black Armada will destroy us all if we don't stand together, Kieran said, his voice steady. I'm not asking for your loyalty, I'm asking for your fight. If we don't rise up now, we will be nothing but shadows on the sea, forgotten like the wrecks beneath us. It wasn't easy to convince the pirates weren't known for their alliances, and trust was hard to come by, but slowly, one by one, the captains agreed they would join forces, for the sake of their freedom, for the future of piracy, and for the chance to fight back. Kieran knew that this was only the first step. Their fleet was small, and their resources were limited, but it was a start, and as he stood on the edge of that forgotten island, watching the dawn break over the horizon, he knew this fight wasn't over. It had only just begun.